There's kind of a cachet with the scrolls too. It just sort of feels like I noticed that with the Danny Jones podcast too, right? Like in the episode I did with him, I think has 700,000 views or what have you, where like it's twice as many as like the stuff that he did for several months prior to that and then afterwards too, right? So
Maybe
but
that's
I
just you.
think I mean maybe, but I suspect as soon as you stick that in the title, people are like, well, this is the Dan Brown effect, right? This is the one thing prior to when I read the novel. I heard about the novel, but people were like super excited about it, right? And I figured I need to read this. And when I did read it, I chuckled because there's like this one part in it where he meets with the scholar philanthropist billionaire, what's his name, Teabing, I think is the character's name, who's providing him all this evidence, right, for the Merovingian connection to
Yes.
Jesus. And then he's like, well, where does like tracing the threads of this, he's like, how far back do you connect this, or where does this connect? And the guy just says, well, all you have to do is read the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that was it. It's the only thing he said
Does it
about
say
them,
that?
right?
Does it really
He
say that?
does. He really does. And it's the sort of thing that most people would not remember, right? But because it's me, because it's anybody who's in the field, it's all we're like, fucking guy, right? Like it's like, and he doesn't explain anything either. Like it just doesn't even attempt. It's just a throwaway line, and I'm sure it's because it sounds great. It's
Well, the thing about the Dead Sea
mysterious.
Scrolls is that they are, even the name, like, because they happen to have been discovered near something called the Dead Sea. There's just something so sort of mysterious about
There's a
it. And
mystique to it.
it's got that Dan Brown thing. It's got the sort of like hidden text in the desert, the sort of Gnostic gospel feeling of these texts that get dug up kind of thing. So, what actually are the Dead Sea Scrolls? What are
All right. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of Jewish, or I should say, of a series of collections of Jewish manuscripts dating between the 3rd century BCE to roughly the 2nd century CE, so covering a period of maybe 400 years, probably a little less than that though. And they are manuscripts, they're scrolls that were discovered in a series of sites along the western shore of the Dead Sea in Israel. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from a site we call Qumran, which comprised 11 caves, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. And these were the first of the scrolls were discovered in this area, but the term has come to cover a lot more material since then. There have been discoveries of manuscripts further south of Qumran at places like Murabat and Nachal Hever and Masada. I'm sure you've heard of the Masada is the spur on the cliffs on the southern shore of the Dead Sea where Herod the Great built his winter palace.
Yes, I've been there.
And yes, it's did you take the tram or did you hike it?
We took the tram.
Yeah.
We were short on time, okay? We weren't
Right. Yeah. No, me
laziness
too.
thing.
So and that's the I can provide the excuse that I was traveling with Peter Flint and he really wanted to take the tram and didn't want to hike. So there you go. But yes, but when you were at Masada, undoubtedly they pointed out, or you saw the so-called synagogue on the site.
I'm sure we will have been. Well, actually, we didn't have a tour or anything. We were just kind of walking around, and so I'm not sure that we will have noticed, to be honest.
So there's a structure that has been identified as a synagogue just on the basis it's a meeting hall, right? And it's got like stone benches built into the sides of the walls and like Roman pillars sort of in the center of it, and it resembles um what we know of Jewish synagogues from later periods of time. So this has been commonly interpreted as a synagogue. It might be, I just don't know. But one of the really interesting things about it, and this probably led to um, further solidify this identification. There was a I think it was a wall compartment or a floor compartment near this particular structure where they opened it up and they found Hebrew manuscripts written in Hebrew, Jewish manuscripts, copies of texts from the Old Testament, but also some other really interesting things. Like there is a Hebrew copy that was discovered there of the book of Ben Sira, which we only know from the Greek. This is one of the apocryphal books, and here they discovered a copy of Hebrew text from Ben Sira, one of the only copies we have. But anyways, the Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish manuscripts that were discovered in this region, basically the Judean desert, in and around the Dead Sea. And in terms of the numbers, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of scrolls that were written predominantly on vellum or leather, but a handful also on papyrus, and quite a few containing texts from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible. But this probably only represents about 30% of the total number of texts. There's a lot more literature in this grouping of manuscripts. So that's what they are.
The biblical stuff is what most people are interested in, because these are discovered in the mid 40s, right? Or 45 or 47, around there, I think.
Yeah, so they were first discovered in 1947. The discoveries extend generally from 1947 to closer to 1960, when some of the later manuscripts in caves were found. It's a fairly famous story. A shepherd looking for his lost sheep throws a rock into a cave and hears the shattering of pottery. When he goes in to check things out, he discovers these bundles wrapped in cloth and soaked in like an oil. And he sees a bunch of jars sort of strewn around the cave. And when they open these up, they discover that they're complete intact scrolls. Now, the remarkable thing about the discovery right away, as you point out, most people are interested in the fact that large numbers of these are biblical manuscripts. And in fact, this first one that was taken out by the Ta'amida Bedouin shepherd who found it was the Great Isaiah Scroll, 1Q Isaiah a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah that scholars have now reliably dated to the end of the 2nd century BCE, maybe the beginning of the 1st century BCE, but remarkable in the fact that it was complete.
It was word for word identical with the Masoretic text. Right?
That's it. That's exactly it. As we've come to learn,
we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
And yes, there's 100 different ways you can validate that statement. Apparently,
an intact version.
And this is the remarkable thing, right? So prior to this time, we had copies of Hebrew Bible texts from the medieval period. The earliest Hebrew manuscripts from which modern Bibles were translated were the Leningrad Codex or the Aleppo Codex, which date to the 10th century CE. So these are properly medieval manuscripts. There's a small handful of other fragmentary Hebrew texts sort of in circulation at the time. One famous one is at the University of Cambridge. It's called the Nash Papyrus. It dates probably to the 1st century BCE. It's a single sheet measuring maybe 20 centimeters by 10 centimeters, and it contains text of the Ten Commandments from both versions in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, sort of spliced and interspersed together. So that was one of our earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there's a smattering of small fragments that you can still go look at. I think at my alma mater at the University of Manchester, they have a handful of early Hebrew manuscript fragments. And when I say early, I mean, third, second, 1st century CE AD copies of Hebrew Bible texts. So when the Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered suddenly, and I think you have to imagine just how dramatic this was in the moment, where once, and I think maybe I need to set this up a little bit, there was a running scholarly assumption that something that big just could not survive under those conditions in that area, that scholars had given up hope of finding anything like the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the reasons for this, I think, had to do with something called the Shapiro scrolls, or the Shapiro forgeries, which were purported to be copies of very ancient Bible manuscripts that were being promoted as 6th century BCE. Turns out they're probably fakes. They're lost. They got lost somewhere in the British Library, so they're gone. So we can't check anymore. But at the time they were discovered, near the end of the 19th century, the scholarly consensus, the opinion of almost all experts who looked at them, who actually saw them, said, yeah, these are fakes. And of course they're fakes, because there's just no way anything could survive from that far back for this long under those conditions where they were found. So I think there was that one of the reasons this was such a surprising discovery was because of this prevailing sentiment, at the time of the 40s and the 1950s, when the Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered, and lo and behold, it's a completely intact copy of the book of Isaiah that measures, like 9 meters long. It's a magnificent artifact.
Yeah, you've seen the real
And
thing, right?
I have. I've spent a week of my life working on the real thing inside the vault at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. When people go to see the Dead Sea Scrolls, very often this is the place where they will go. There is a beautiful subterranean exhibit on the property there called the Shrine of the Book, and on display in the rotunda, right in the center of the exhibit, is a replica, an exact replica of the manuscript 1Q Isaiah A, and they will put in and out of circulation smaller fragments from some of the other manuscripts. But nothing is ever on permanent display. And the reason for this is because the worst things for ancient manuscripts are light and humidity, and certainly the changing light and changing humidity. So
Yeah.
we have, very tragically, also, come to discover over the last 70 years of working on these things just how terribly fragile they are, because the fragments that are still there at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, uh, even though they are strictly climate controlled and light controlled and guarded, environmentally protected to the best of their ability, they are still falling apart before our very eyes. And yes. So all that to say, yes, I've been inside the vault with the genuine article, with the real thing, where I spent a week working as a PhD student with one of my supervisors and mentors, Peter W. Flint, and Eugene Ulrich, who published the official edition of both 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B.
We'll get back to Kipp in just a moment, but first, something that's really important to manuscript scholars is objectivity, and that's got a lot to do with bias. Bias also shows up on the popular level in the news that we read every single day. We can never get rid of media bias, but wouldn't it be great if there were a way to objectively compare the way that the same story is being warped by the reporting of different outlets? Well, that is exactly what today's sponsor, Ground News, allows you to do. Ground News aggregates thousands of local and international news outlets all in one place, so you can compare reporting across the political spectrum. Try it out by going to ground.news/AlexOC. Take a look at this story about the German Catholic Church condemning a provocative carnival float linking Jesus to church sex abuse. Using Ground News, I can see that of all the sources reporting on this story, only one of them is right-leaning, with 67% of them being left-leaning and the rest sitting in the center. This means that if you only tend to read right-leaning news, you could have missed this story altogether. And Ground News also provides information about the factuality and ownership of the different sources. There's even a dedicated blind spot tab, which specifically seeks out stories you would otherwise miss based on the news that you usually read. So, broaden your informational inputs and see the stories you would otherwise miss by going to ground.news/AlexOC or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. Use my link to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. That said, back to Kipp. Yeah, and it's quite astonishing in many ways. I mean, talking about how it's degraded just being in the museum, the fact that it survived for so long, like thousands of years in the desert, is pretty incredible. And it's just so fortunate. It
really is.
The desert conditions just happen to be wonderful for preserving manuscripts, which is why if you want to find ancient manuscripts, biblical manuscripts, you don't go to biblical sites. You go to Egypt, you go to Qumran, because these places just happen to be really good for the preservation of manuscripts. When the Gospel of Judas was discovered, the apocryphal Gospel of Judas was dug up from the desert, and before it got published, there were a bunch of people trying to sell it, and it moved around, and it spent something like 10 years in a safety deposit box in New York City, which almost destroyed it. It's just unfathomable how delicate these things are and how mistreated they often are by people who just don't know what they're doing.
It's true. It's very true. And it's been a learning process for scholars over the course of the last 60 or 70 years of discovery. There's a similar story actually about some of the scrolls in the first discoveries. When 1Q Isaiah A is purported to be the one that was first taken by the Bedouin out of the cave, but they actually took 7 manuscripts in total. These were 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B, a text known as the War Scroll, which in itself is a pretty remarkable apocalyptic telling, somewhat similar to things that you read in the book of Revelation about the battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness in the last days. And then they found a commentary on the book of Habakkuk, where text from the biblical prophetic book of Habakkuk would be quoted, followed by a contemporary interpretation as to what it means for the people who were living at that time. And then there were rule texts, so-called community rule, which told of regulations for living in this Jewish community, which we believe were the ones responsible for writing and collecting the scrolls. And then another text called the Hodayot, which is a large, rather exquisite collection of poems and songs sounding very similar to things that you read in the book of Psalms, but 100% entirely different. A completely unique poetical composition in the same genre from a later period in time. And then finally, the Genesis Apocryphon, which is an Aramaic text. Not all. It's important for me to point out, not all the texts were written in Hebrew. We have hundreds of manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls which were written in Aramaic, which is really interesting in a couple of regards. And I won't get into it, but it's sort of a fascinating turn on what this collection is and who was putting it together, and it tells us something too about just Jewish literacy within Jewish Palestine, Greco-Roman Palestine, and the ways people were interacting with their text. So there were these 7 manuscripts which were
And
part
to
of
be
the first
clear,
discovery.
the reason why the Great Isaiah Scroll is called 1Q Isaiah A is it so 1Q refers to the first cave of Qumran, so like
Exactly.
1Q, 1 Qumran, and then it'll be Isa for Isaiah, the name of the text,
Yep.
and then A because it's like the first version. So you'll also have like
And
you've got like I suppose is there a 1Q Isaiah B? I know there's a 4Q
yes.
Isaiah A and a 4Q Isaiah B. There'll be a 1Q Isaiah B, and they all have this kind. So when you see these fancy sort of looking words, it's helpful to that. I think that helps to sort of
Yeah,
decode what
that's
you're looking
good.
at there.
Yeah, absolutely. And every manuscript gets both a catalog designation like that, and also a catalog number. So I believe some of the catalog numbers you just never hear. Like I believe 1Q Isaiah A is actually 1Q8 or 7. But again, I don't even know because it's just the
Yeah,
number
but
is
all
not
fancy
something
sounding
that.
terms, but just
Yeah,
bear in mind that you're looking at the name of the number of the cave, and then the kind of the text
correct.
that we're
And
dealing with here.
there were 11 caves, right? And there were manuscripts discovered in 10 of the 11 caves. There were no manuscripts discovered in cave 10 itself. So that's where the numbers come from. So all of these ones from the first discoveries are 1Q manuscripts. So 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Pesher Habakkuk, which is the way we talk about a commentary. And then 1Q M, which is the shortened form for milchama is the Hebrew word for war. And then 1QH, which is short for chodayot, the Hebrew word for praises, for the so-called Thanksgiving hymns, that sort of thing. So there were these 7 manuscripts that were discovered at first. They the Bedouin who found them held on to them for some time, and originally also struggled to find someone interested in buying them. In Bethlehem, they circulated them among antiquities dealers and people in merchants working in the markets and not getting much traction. They were eventually sold to 4 of them were eventually sold to an antiquities dealer and a cobbler in Bethlehem by the name of Iskander Shahin. He's more commonly known as Kando. And he ended up being basically the broker for sales of manuscript fragments that the Bedouin continued to find in the desert and the archaeologists who worked on the text. But from this first discovery, he purchased 4. The remaining 3 were handed off to a friend of his by the name of George Assay. And George Assay also was in contact with a professor at the Hebrew University by the name of Eliezer Sukenik, a professor of archaeology, who was one of the first scholars to see the Dead Sea Scrolls and was so excited about what he saw that he, um, with some doing, managed to secure some money from the Hebrew University to purchase. He wanted to purchase all of them, but only had the opportunity to purchase the other 3 that weren't already bought by Kando. Now, so they ended up the first 7 ended up being split up right away. 3 of them ended up at the Hebrew University. The remaining 4, Kando then uh he was brokering this sale with a Syrian Orthodox priest by the name of shoot, what's his name? Sorry, Athanasius Samuel. So, the 4 were ended up with the Syrian Orthodox priest, Athanasius Samuel, and, this all happened as well in 1947. So, at the same time, the Second World had ended a few years before. There was a strong movement afoot for an independent state of Israel. There was a lot of tension in the city of Jerusalem and certainly in the region. And in November of 1947, the state of Israel was officially declared and ratified by the United Nations. The British mandate had come to an end, and many people who were living in the region packed up and left. In large part just because of increased, political tension and things that were going on, um, in in the rest of the world. And Athanasius Samuel, packed his stuff up, including his 4 scrolls, and went to the United States. And for there's some very good, um, old video recordings of some of the manuscripts, some of the scrolls themselves, and a number of these actually come from places like the Library of Congress or from Johns Hopkins, University, where Athanasius Samuel was on a months-long tour of the US with his 4 manuscripts, attempting to find a buyer, and unsuccessfully so at that. And the reason for this was because with the recent establishment of the state of Israel, there was growing concern that, this new state of Israel would then just nationalize everything that ended up on the market, and in so doing, basically annex it and take it back, into their own custody. So, this for 2 years, Athanasius Samuel wandered around, without able to find any buyers, for these 4 fabulous manuscripts that he had. He famously took out an advertisement in the classifieds of the Wall Street Journal. The heading on it is 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale, and the body of the text says, "These would make a wonderful gift for an academic institution or for a religious institution of some sort." So there is this ongoing. I think this just this is kind of the nature of working with antiquities and with material culture of all sorts. And a lot of this is just because this is such sensitive material with such wide ranging implications, religious implications, but also political implications as well. Most of it ends up going underground and passing through shady antiquities dealers or places like that before ever seeing the light of day. But yeah, the scrolls
Man,
are no
it's a hell of
exception
a
in that
story. I
regard.
mean, it's always the case with these manuscripts, discoveries, and transportations. It's shocking and weird and incredible. But eventually, these manuscripts are translated. You can read them online. Like, we know what's inside them, and they've been studied to a pretty extensive degree. But people might sort of forget that 1947 isn't that long ago. If you compare it to New Testament studies, which, even at that time, even in the 40s, New Testament studies was small enough that, like, there's nothing like the kind of materials even that we have today. People have been studying these texts for it's
Thousands
incalculably
of
longer
years.
than
Yes.
and so although a lot of study has been done into the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's still so much being done and some cutting edge stuff that you've been telling me about, which we'll get into, that's incredibly interesting. But the thing about, like, looking at the Isaiah scroll is that Christians, Jews, they discover the 1Q Isaiah A and they all sort of go, phew, like, okay, thank goodness, because they could have unearthed a text that was completely different to the version that we have today, and it would have really upset the idea that the Bible is the inspired word of God. But luckily, with some variants, the text was almost identical, and so told us something important about the preservation of biblical texts, and gave us an indication into the care that is taken in preserving this story of the book of Isaiah, right?
Yeah, but I think too, on you raise a couple of important issues with that observation, Alex. On the one hand, I think it's worth mentioning here. I talked just very briefly about these Shapira forgeries from the late 19th century, which kind of affected scholarly opinions about what's even possible, right? One of, I think, the motivating factors in terms of how scholars approached those particular manuscripts is in that these did not match up identically with the biblical text. In this case, the biblical text of Deuteronomy. One of the things that we know about these transcriptions of these forgeries is that they presented an elaborately different version of the book of Deuteronomy, and one that, confirms or aligns with scholarly views about the composition of the book of Deuteronomy from, the 6th century, the 7th century, and as a text that developed over time. I think this has an effect on the way that scholars even will handle these materials. The excitement and the attention that the Dead Sea Scrolls gained at their discovery was very much fueled by these questions. What does this do for our for whatever it is we know about the text of the Bible? How does this affect what we think we know about early Christianity, even? And
Yes, because of course this time the Dead Sea Scrolls are written, broadly speaking, I mean, it's a few hundred years, but it roughly coincides with the time of Christ. So although it doesn't say anything about Jesus, there's no New Testament manuscripts or anything like that, what we do have is an indication of the kind of things that Jews believed at the time
yes,
that Jesus was alive, which or just before Jesus came, which is incredibly useful of its own accord, even if we don't have any Christian literature among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
very much so. In fact, this is one of the directions I mean, there's a number of things that we could talk about in terms of how the Dead Sea Scrolls have affected biblical scholarship more generally, and it just in a few ways, not just they've not just been extremely valuable for um, increasing our understanding of the text of the Bible at this period of time. They've provided a window into Jewish culture at the time of Jesus, or leading up to the time of Jesus and the emergence of the church. And this has been, in large part, a surprise. The Dead Sea Scrolls, over the course of the last 60 or 70 years, have really had a significant effect in overturning and revolutionizing our understanding of the shape of early Judaism, in some pretty exciting and some really interesting ways. You know, most of the first scholars. Well, I should correct myself. All of the first scholars who saw, handled, and worked with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and the 50s were Christians. They were not Jewish, and this also had a major effect on the ways in which, certainly in the early days, the scrolls were organized or collected and interpreted. For example, the 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 scrolls were housed and kept basically and studied at the École Biblique, which is the Dominican French school of archaeology in East Jerusalem. And most of the members of the editorial team in the beginning were Dominican priests. So when they would read a lot of the non-biblical literature, a lot of the literature that was produced by this community in the early days, and when you read some of the early material that they wrote, it felt like they were writing about, an ascetic religious sect, very much like the Dominicans. Go figure. It's something we all have a tendency to read our own narratives into these things. I think this is what you see coming from Christian apologists as well when it comes to the question of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and something that I am constantly eager to encounter and correct in terms of the ways in which they want to evaluate the text are relative to this question of how reliable or how close is our Bible to the ancient Bible. It's the primary question, the priority question that they always ask with regards to the scrolls. But even in just asking that question does not provide a clear enough or a comprehensive enough answer or perspective on what this discovery is, and the very many ways in which these manuscripts are really valuable for increasing our understanding of this part of the world at this particular point in time.
So, who do we think wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls? You talked about when they're from, but what kind of Jews are sitting down and putting these manuscripts together?
So yes, so we know from the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, as well as another first century writer, Philo of Alexandria, of different competing sects of Judaism in and around this time. We know of the Sadducees or the Sadducites, who were part of the Jewish aristocracy and in charge of the temple. We know of the Pharisees, and you'll recognize these groups also from the New Testament, who were more of a widespread populist group of Jews that probably emerged out of the question of how to do Judaism without being part of the temple ritual on a regular basis. But this was really a reformative movement in an effort to make Judaism as practical and as I'll just say as practical and pragmatic just within the Hellenistic Roman world. So we know of these groups. We also know of another group called the Essenes. And both Josephus and Philo tell us that the Essenes lived in various places in and around the region, but were particularly concentrated on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Excuse me. They go on to tell us about some of their beliefs and their practices. Uh, they identify them as sort of a secret sect, not interested in interacting or spreading the gospel among their fellow men. They kept to themselves. They were extremely concerned with matters of ritual purity and had a very strict approach to the observance of the rules of the Torah, certainly much more strict than that of the Pharisees. So, based on the types of literature that we've discovered within the Dead Sea Scrolls, which seem to be self-identifying, where the writers are speaking of their own community, these tend to align with things that Josephus and Philo tell us about the Essenes, and that, coupled with the geographical identification, has most scholars convinced that they were produced by a group of the Essenes or by a group that was very similar
Right.
to the Essenes.
Sure. Okay, so we've got the Essenes, as many scholars believe, writing these texts in sort of over this 300-ish year period around the time of the turn of the millennium. And so we end up having these biblical texts. We've talked about the Isaiah scroll, which, as we said, is pretty darn similar to the Isaiah that we have in the Masoretic text in the Old Testament that we sort of have in the Bible today. Not word for word, no. But pretty close, let's say. But that's not the only Old Testament text that we have. It's the only complete one, I think. But we have other sort of quite large chunks of other texts which aren't quite as, don't quite have the same accuracy,
cachet, or even accuracy. Yeah. So this is really something that I get worked up about just in my own profession, in my own work. So one of the things that you commonly hear from Christian apologists in particular is this remarkable level of correspondence that you see between texts of the Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls with copies of the Masoretic text, and this is the text type, the standard text of the Hebrew Bible that survived into the medieval period. And for some reason, lots of Christians are really worked up about the text aligning with the Masoretic text in particular, which is kind of funny, because one of the things that we know, we knew this already, that there were competing versions of Old Testament texts in circulation at the time of Jesus.
How do we?
One of the reasons we know this.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I was going to ask how we know that. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the reasons we know this is because, in the first place, wherever New Testament authors are quoting the Bible, they're always quoting from the Greek translation, or almost always quoting from the Greek translation of the of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. But there are a number of places where it clearly doesn't match up there either. And then we also have this Greek translation of the Old Testament, which probably dates back to the 3rd century BCE, or at least the Torah portion, the part of the Pentateuch. But in many places, this document called the Septuagint does not, and actually pretty dramatically departs from the Hebrew text that we know from this medieval Masoretic text. So we already knew about some of this textual pluriformity. There's another version of certainly the Pentateuch that survives, the Torah, called the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is still in use by the tiny surviving community of Samaritan Jews still out on Mount Gerizim in the northern part of the country. So we already knew about the existence of some of this stuff, and it shouldn't come as any surprise to know that among the hundreds of so-called biblical manuscripts that we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see quite a bit of representation, not just of something that looks like the Masoretic text. And I think it's important to point out that when you go back this far with texts this old, prior to the establishment of the sorts of scribal conventions that led to a stronger sense of preservation, which all happened later, you go back this far, you will discover that there are no two manuscripts that look exactly the same. No two copies of the same text from the Dead Sea Scrolls looks exactly the same. They are all a little different, but some of them are pretty remarkably different from one another. As an example, in mentioning the Septuagint, one of the features of the Septuagint is the book of Jeremiah, which we know in two pretty dramatically different versions. The one that survives in the Masoretic text in the Hebrew.
Oh, and what is the Masoretic text? Just quickly.
Oh, so yeah, so this is the standard text of the Hebrew Bible that has survived into the medieval period, on which all of our English translations, or most of our English translations of the Old Testament, are based. And this is the one that we know from those 10th century codices, the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. So we did find examples of texts that look very close to the Masoretic text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, we've got those, but we've got all these other things too.
So Jeremiah, you were talking about.
So Jeremiah is in the Hebrew text. It is 13% longer than the Greek translation of the book of Jeremiah from the Septuagint, and it's in a dramatically different order. Like chunks and entire chapters and huge sections of text have just been jumbled around and tossed about in a completely different structure. Prior to the discovery of the scrolls, scholars already knew, and scholars were convinced that there was pretty significant development just within this single composition. Scholars were convinced that the Septuagint version, the Greek translation, was translated from an older Hebrew version, and that what we have in the Masoretic text is actually a dramatically revised, updated Hebrew version. And one of the things that we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls was 6 copies of the book of Jeremiah, 2 of which look pretty close to the Masoretic text in terms of their text type, at least. That's the language and the alignment. Maybe not in terms of structure, which is another question. But then 2 of the manuscripts look actually very, very close in terms of both the text and the structure to the Greek translation that we know in the Septuagint. So the natural conclusion of scholars is that among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have both of these competing versions in circulation at the same time being used by this same group of people. And there's even while we're talking about Jeremiah, I'll just mention one more thing. I've worked fairly extensively with a particular manuscript, 4Q Jeremiah A. So you'll recognize that as coming from K4 at Qumran. And this is the first copy of the book of Jeremiah from K4. It also happens to be one of the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, making it one of our oldest biblical manuscripts anywhere. It dates to probably the end of the second century. Probably the end of the 3rd century BCE. And within this particular manuscript, there is a section between chapter 7 and chapter 8 where the scribe, he's writing along, and he comes to the end of Jeremiah chapter 7:28, and he ends his paragraph and leaves an open line to the end of the column, and then goes to the next line to start a new paragraph. But instead of starting with verse 29, he starts with chapter 8, verse 5, and then continues in his writing. Now, somebody else came along after probably 100 years of this manuscript being in circulation, and we can tell this on the basis of analyzing handwriting styles, which is one of the ways in which is the way we commonly date the manuscripts. So by analyzing the handwriting styles, I can see that another scribe has come along after decades, maybe 100 years, and inserted into the margin, into the blank paragraph space, 3 lines, and then he's run out of space, so he actually has to go and write along the edge of the column, the column break in between the 2 columns. He writes another 4 lines, but still hasn't completed his text, so he turns the whole thing like right upside down, and then just finishes his text upside down in the bottom margin. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that even prior to the discovery of this particular manuscript, there was some suggestion by scholars that this section between Jeremiah chapter 7:29, or sorry, Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 28 and chapter 8 verse 5 was probably a secondary addition by a later writer working in the text of Jeremiah. And now we have a manuscript in our possession where you can see this happening. I hesitate to say real time, just because we're dealing with artifacts that are thousands of years old, but we're certainly looking at a situation where this was not a native part of this particular manuscript of Jeremiah. And this is the kind of thing, this is for my perspective as a biblical scholar, as a textual critic, as a scribal specialist, as someone who's keenly interested in questions with regards to the composition and the shape and the reception of the biblical text through time. This is all intensely interesting to me, and this is the kind of thing that we see all over the place in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see active scribal involvement in the texts of the Bible in such a way that, quite frankly, is fairly surprising. It was fairly surprising to scholars when they started to dig in to the texts of the Bible, just how active scribes were in the authorial process and the transmission process of these texts.
Yes, and that also potentially shows up in the Great Isaiah Scroll.
It does.
Evidence of scribal notation, as it were, that might tell us something interesting about Isaiah. Now, especially given that the Isaiah Scroll is celebrated as giving us an insight into the text's preservation, there is a fascinating line of thought about the book of Isaiah that it is not written by one author. It's not written by one guy called Isaiah, but instead is made up of multiple authors kind of put together under the name of Isaiah. And for a long time, scholars had separated like the first writer and the second writer. There is some thought that it's split into 3 parts as well, and there's some dispute over exactly where that split occurs. But one way of splitting up the book of Isaiah thematically is up to verse 33, and then from verse 34 onwards. And there's sort of a thematic break, and everything sort of changes. And so there was some idea that there's actually 2 different texts being written here. So before looking at the manuscript evidence, like, do we have good reason outside of that to already suspect this multiple authorship, and where does that idea come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an idea that's already hundreds of years old. This is based on observations by scholars and specialists back in the 19th century with regards to Isaiah. So just there are 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, and early on, scholars noted that in the first place, Isaiah himself, Isaiah the prophet, is mentioned. So there's a couple of narrative sections in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 6, there's the story of his call, right? His call to be a prophet of Yahweh. He's in the temple worshiping. He sees a vision of God and has his lips seared by burning hot coals. It's a lovely story. And then in chapters 36 through 39 is a large narrative chunk that is actually almost identical. There are some clear differences, but there's an obvious relationship, an obvious close correspondence between this story of Isaiah and the king Hezekiah and the invading Assyrians with stuff that we read from Second Kings. So I don't know the scholarly discussion enough to know which direction scholars tend to think this is going, whether the older text is in Isaiah or in Second Kings. But in any event, this is something that is known outside of the book of Isaiah. So that's chapters 36 through 39. Now, in all the rest of the stuff, like in all the prophecies themselves, Isaiah's name pops up only 6 times. And all of those instances happen to be in this first half before the narrative section in chapter 36 starts. So everything from chapter 1 through chapter 35, this is where you find these 6 mentions of the prophet's name. He is never mentioned after that at any point. So this was a clue right away to scholars. But the really big one, some of the important information that they looked at carefully was just how dramatically different this second half of Isaiah was. Within the first half, within these first 35 chapters, 34, 35 chapters or so, the nature of Isaiah's language, his concerns, his message, many of the themes were really focused on the events of the 8th century, the impending invasion of Assyria, the so-called Syro-Ephraimite War prior to that. These were primary concerns in this part of the book. And then there's a dramatic shift in chapter 40. The tone changes. We're introduced now to a different type of literature, which we more readily identify or recognize as the servant songs. It's this high level poetic kind of literature, and these texts seem much more naturally set at a time when there is no temple. One of the key features in this part of the book is that the author is pining and bemoaning the fact that there's no temple in Jerusalem, which seems strange if it's being written by Isaiah the prophet back in the 8th century. So this is a clue right away to scholars. And then in chapter 42, one of the prophecies makes mention by name of Cyrus the Great. Yahweh calls Cyrus my Messiah, who's coming to basically take the Jewish people back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Cyrus the Great lived in the 6th century BCE. So either this is a remarkable piece of evidence for the fulfillment of an actual datable prophecy to the 8th century, fulfilled some 200 years in the future, or we're dealing with a different kind of text written at a different point in time. And this is through the accumulation of pieces of evidence like this, checking and noting just some of the vocabulary and the sentence structure differences between these two parts of this book. Scholars have quite unanimously concluded that this is precisely what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a core set of oracles belonging to Isaiah ben Amoz, who lived in the 8th century, or maybe some of his followers that were collected together and forming this core in Isaiah chapter 1 through 33, 34, 35. There's some speculation about that, followed by this narrative section, chapter 36 to 39. But then at some point later in time, additional prophecies were added on to this manuscript in the form of these songs and oracles from a later period of time during the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 587 BCE. Somebody, who probably was a follower of the teachings of Isaiah and a big fan of the writings of Isaiah, probably took his Isaiah scroll and started adding things to it. We're not entirely sure when these things take place, but there's definitely some level of inspiration or influence from the first half to the second half, but a clear enough distinction between the two that have convinced us that we're dealing with two separate compositions. And we actually have, I'll just say one more thing about this. We actually have an analog for how this works in another collection of texts from the Hebrew Bible. What we know of as the minor prophets, these are the small prophetic books that appear after Ezekiel, that includes Hosea, Amos, Joel, Nahum, Micah, Habakkuk, on and on. There's 12 of them. We see within Jewish collections of these texts, within Jewish Bibles, that the 12 prophets, the so-called minor prophets, appear to have always been collected together as a single group. And in fact, when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is what we see. There are copies of manuscripts of the 12 prophets from Masada, from Murdabat, from Qumran. And the one thing they all seem to have in common is that all of these individual shorter compositions of prophets were collected together on the same manuscript. There's some really interesting differences between the individual copies of these books, but this is an example of how something like this can happen, where people were developing and people were writing anthologies, not just books belonging to a single author, but books based on individual themes or ideas or theological principles that they would collect together on the same scroll. And this seems to be what happened with the text of Isaiah. This anonymous collection of songs and poems written after the destruction of Jerusalem during the exile came to be collected along with the book of Isaiah proper from the 8th
and then get
century
merged
BCE.
into one text at some point.
Yes,
So
at some
what
point.
is the manuscript evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're dealing with two authors or two texts under the umbrella of the book of Isaiah here?
So it's really substantive. I'll say that at the outset. There is a ton of data, and I'll go through all of it here, which shows that even by the 2nd or 1st century BCE, there was an awareness of the existence of these two compositions, of a first Isaiah and at least a second Isaiah. And we see this right within the Great Isaiah Scroll itself. You alluded to it within the manuscript, right in the center at the end of column 27 is the end of chapter 33, Isaiah chapter 33. And at the end of the column, at the very bottom, the scribe has left 3 empty lines of text. There's nothing there. It's blank. And he started chapter 34 at the top of the following column. Importantly, this break also happens at the end of a sheet. When it comes to large scrolls, Alex, the way that they're made is the animal is slaughtered, skinned. The skin is scraped and prepared, and then they are ruled in columns and lines. A scribe comes and writes on them. And if it's a particularly large manuscript, they will stitch several of these sheets, these individual sheets together to complete the whole thing. So importantly, this break also appears at the end of a sheet. Now, this is something that the casual observer is going to miss. But it's also something that scholars have known about and recognized from the very beginning. William Brownlee, who was my own PhD supervisor's PhD supervisor, writing about this manuscript in the 1950s, was already talking about what he called the bisection in 1Q Isaiah A, this break between chapter 33 and chapter 34. He wrote a couple of articles about this.
We'll put this
already
on screen
back
for
in the
people to
1950s.
see, because it's like it's the kind of thing, as you say, for the casual reader, it kind of looks kind of natural because you're already near the bottom of the page and it's a small gap. It's like 3 lines, maybe 2. It's probably 3. It's sort of 2 or 3. Isn't this just the kind of thing that, like, he got near the bottom of the page and thought, it's a new sentence, or so, I'm going to start on the next page?
But this is the thing, right? It's not. And we have an accumulation of manuscript evidence from the time period, from different sites, which demonstrates this. The significant thing about this break is that the only time this ever occurs in any manuscript, any Second Temple manuscript, this is a manuscript from the same time period, these Jewish manuscripts, any time that this kind of a multi-line break appears, it always only means the same thing, and that is that the scribe is moving on from the end of one composition to the beginning of the other. So we see breaks like this. They're rare, but where we do see them, they always occur at the ends of books and the starts of new books. So, for example, we have a couple of manuscripts of the Torah, or at least a couple books from the Torah, from the Pentateuch, where you will see the last verse of the book of Genesis, followed by 3 empty lines, and then the first verse at the beginning of Exodus. Or you will see the last verse of the book of Leviticus, followed by 3 empty lines, and the beginning of the first verse from the book of Numbers. So we already have an established pattern here for what this means. I mentioned the minor prophet scrolls earlier. They don't even leave multi-line breaks. The breaks between the individual prophets in a number of these minor prophet scrolls is just a single line. So if this is what this break means everywhere else, then we should take that seriously and understand that that's probably what this means here. This probably means that this is the end of first Isaiah in the mind of this scribe, and that the top of at the beginning of chapter 34 is the beginning of a new composition. So that's the break, but there's a lot more to it.
Well, this is interesting, right? If it's just the break, I remember when you first told me about this,
Yeah.
and I thought that's cool. That's really interesting. Like some indication, manuscript evidence of this, of this break. Now, importantly, prior to this, scholars had discussed the idea of there being 2 or maybe 3 Isaiahs: the Proto-Isaiah, the Deutero-Isaiah, and possibly the Trito-Isaiah. And the breakup there is slightly different because they often have first Isaiah, Proto-Isaiah, ending at verse 39, and with Deutero-Isaiah beginning with verse 40. So you might expect that if there was this gap, it would appear between 39 and 40. But since the 20th century, people have theorized otherwise. They've looked, for example, at the themes. So verses 1 to chapters 1 to 33 consist of warnings about judgments that are going to happen, promises of things that will happen to Jerusalem, speaking about it in the future tense, whereas chapters 34 onwards seem to assume that judgment has already taken place. The restoration of Jerusalem is already happening. So there's this thematic break that seems to coincide with this textual break as well.
So yeah, exactly. And I think people like in terms of gaining a clearer understanding of this too, like while most scholars will tell you just in simple terms that first Isaiah is chapters 1 through 39. Let's remember as well that those last 3 chapters 36 through 39, this is the narrative section that looks like it was just pulled out of a different text altogether. So what do you do with that? That looks like it's probably something that was added on at one point in time. But even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and certainly since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there has been quite a bit of discussion among scholars about chapters 34 and 35 already being later inserted into the text at some point later in time. So there was already some thought among scholars prior to this discovery that the developmental history of this text was quite a bit more complicated than the simple lines in which we have chosen to draw it up in. So, but this is, it's to my eye a clear indication that at least scholars are on the right track when it comes to tracking the development of these things. And I mean, if it was just that, I mean, that would be enough for me. But there's a lot more to this as well.
So I want to talk about some of the further evidence, because another thing that people will point to is the fact that Isaiah is 66 chapters long. This break occurs after verse 33, which is exactly halfway through the text. Now, it may be that there are just 2 texts that happen to have the same number of chapters, that this gap indicates the end of one and the beginning of the next, but is it a bit suspicious that it occurs exactly halfway through, as if to say that there might be something special about the 2 halves of Isaiah? It seems unlikely that you would just happen to have 2 texts with the same number of chapters. It seems more like this is a unified text, and for some reason it's been sort of split down right at the middle. Do you find anything suspicious in that placement, bang on in the middle of the book?
So I tend to view that differently. To me, this looks like the natural way that a scribe would be reconstructing his text. one of the things that we know about scribes and readers and writers from antiquity is that they really enjoyed looking for these sorts of patterns of correspondence. So it seems like a natural move for a scribe who already has the existence of these two texts that are coming together, that he's going to go, well, this first, he's going to look for those points of harmony, I think, or those points of parallel between the two. So I would say I tend to look at this as just a feature, a natural feature of scribal development that we also know from other sorts of compositions. You see the same sort of thing happening in something like the Book of Psalms, which has been compiled together from like large numbers of different types of collections, but put together in such a way as to provide some structural harmony to the whole thing. So that's that. I tend to look at this as a feature of scribal development in terms of improving the structural harmony of this new thing that we now call this larger composition of Isaiah. Does that make sense?
Yes, but so people will be listening to this and they might be not convinced by that. They might say, I still find that incredibly suspicious. So the only evidence that you have, Dr. Davis, is that there are two authors going on here, is that there's this 3-line gap, which there could be hundreds of explanations for that. So as you've alluded to, I will ask you a question I know the answer to. Are there other reasons to think that these two sections of Isaiah are written by different authors?
There are, in fact, several. And I'll go through these last ones a little bit more quickly.
Mhm.
So, in the second half of Isaiah, excuse me, from the Great Isaiah Scroll, we know that this particular part of the text, this particular manuscript, was copied from a different copy than the first half. So, the scroll who wrote the first half of Isaiah, Isaiah chapters 1 through 33, in the Great Isaiah Scroll had a copy of Isaiah before him that he was, transcribing onto his new document. The scribe the second half of this manuscript, chapters 34 through 66, was copied from a separate manuscript. And the reason we know that is because there's some unusual features within just the second half, where there is a repeating pattern of breaks in the text, with secondary scribal insertions. And there's been some work done by a Dead Sea Scroll scholar named Drew Longaker. He wrote an article back in 2014 where he argued quite convincingly that you can actually, map this out for the entire manuscript and demonstrate that the copy that the scribe was using for this second half of Isaiah was actually damaged at the bottom. So he was missing one or two, maybe 3 lines of text at the bottom of every column of his manuscript that he was trying to copy. And he would encounter a place where he get to the bottom, damage part of the manuscript, and usually wasn't confident about what was there, didn't know what was there, so he decided just to leave an empty space, and resolve to come back and fill it in at a later point in time, or maybe somebody else will come back and fill in the missing text. But sometimes there's a few places where he feels pretty sure about what he knows the text is and goes ahead and just kind of freehands it. He writes in what he remembers or what he thinks the missing text must be, but every single time it's a little different. It's a clear paraphrase. So if you put these things, you add them all up and you put it together, it's pretty obvious that the scroll was different for this second half of this book. And
So
in
we're looking at
addition to
somebody
that,
who's got this manuscript that's damaged at the bottom, and occasionally it looks like they filled it in such a way that shows they knew what the text was, but they didn't actually have
yes,
it in front of them because it's not like
yes,
quite right. It's like, oh, what's that Bible verse about? Like it's easier for a rich man to part. Yeah, I know, and you sort of write it out from what you remember, and it's close enough, but you're doing it from memory.
yes, just like that. So and it's important to point like to emphasize that this is a repeating pattern, right? So you can actually
Right.
track it with math. You can measure the distance between where each one of these instances occurs, and you end up with it happening basically in the same point as you're going through the entire manuscript. But this raises a question for us in the first place. I think, why on earth, if if the book of Isaiah is a complete, intact 66 chapter composition at the time that this manuscript is being prepared and written, why on earth would a scribe need to use a different copy for the second half? The obvious answer, I think, is because this is how the text was known at this time, that it existed in these two halves. But in addition to that, I think I mentioned to you ahead of the show that I actually I attended a virtual conference or a virtual lecture yesterday at the Oriel College at the University of Oxford. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
I've
Um,
heard of it.
yeah. So every year they host the Charles Knapp Lecture, and this year the presenters were Milan Popovich and Maruf Dali from the University of Groningen, who a number of years ago ran a very exciting ERC project called The Hands That Wrote the Bible, where they developed um, machine learning tools to help investigate uh, scripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls in an effort to identify individual scribal hands and to improve our efforts toward dating and identifying manuscripts using paleography. Now, they spent a lot of time working on this particular manuscript, 1Q Isaiah A, because of course they did. It's intact. It's, in terms of a data set, it's probably the biggest individual one. And while to the naked eye, when you look at the two halves of 1Q Isaiah A, even to the naked eye of specialists in this field, the two hands look the same. It looks like it was the same scribe who wrote both the first half and the second half of this manuscript. When in actual fact, we have discovered, or I should say, um, Popovich and Dolly have discovered through their through the tools that they've developed that the second half was not only copied from a different exemplar, a different manuscript, it was also copied by a different scribe altogether. It's an exciting project overall because it's an excellent um, demonstration of the interdisciplinary work between scientists and technologists and antiquities specialists. But it's very exciting. And I'll mention one other thing about this manuscript, something that we observed. I worked on the official publication of 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B a number of years ago. And one of the things that we were doing when we were working on 1Q Isaiah A was looking at these early parts of the manuscript in the first half where the individual sheets appeared to have folds in them. Now, the intriguing thing is that this only appears in the first half of the manuscript. At the time when the volume eventually came to be published, we weren't entirely sure what to do with this feature. In the intervening time, scholars have worked on this more in earnest, and it have come to discover basically that at one point in time, this first half, first Isaiah, chapters 1 to 33 of 1Q Isaiah A, was actually, detached entirely from the second half and stored in a folded position as opposed to a rolled position. And this is different from the second half, which was rolled. And it looks as though this is something that was happening for a while before these two halves were even put together. So there you have the break.
Wow.
At the end of chapter 33. You have the two manuscripts having been copied from separate exemplars. You have the two manuscripts having been copied by by two separate scribes. You have the two manuscripts having been stored differently for a period of time before they were combined. And then you also have what appears to be a different textual alignment in the first half as compared to the second half. So we talked a little bit about variation in 1Q Isaiah A, right? And there's the 2600 textual variants that the editors have counted in 1Q Isaiah A. And most people compare these to the Masoretic text. One of the other things that appears to be the case, and I don't think the legwork on this has actually been done, but scholars have started to really notice that the first half of 1Q Isaiah A uh, does not align as closely to the Masoretic text as the second half of 1Q Isaiah A. So you have all of these data points, and then I'll give you the one more that doesn't get talked about enough that I get really excited about. At this point, we start talking about what is happening with the book of Isaiah in the rest of the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 21 copies in total of text from the book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The vast majority of these come from Cave 4. We have 2 from Cave 1 and 1 from Cave 5. Now, the 2 from Cave 1, we know, 1Q Isaiah A, 1Q Isaiah B. There are 2 more copies from Cave 4, 4Q Isaiah A and 4Q Isaiah C. I believe that's right. Both of these appear to have been at one time complete copies of all of Isaiah from chapter 1 through to chapter 66. Just like 1Q Isaiah A, just like 1Q Isaiah B. And we know this because even though they're fragmentary, they preserve material from every single part of the book of Isaiah, from all of these many different sections. But what's really interesting is looking at the remaining 17 copies of the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what we discover is that among these, each individual manuscript contained only text from the first half of Isaiah, Isaiah chapters 1 through 33, or the second half of Isaiah, chapters 34 through 66. And this is across the board. 17 manuscripts, 9 preserving text from only the first part of Isaiah, another 8 preserving text from only the second part of Isaiah. Like that's, I mean, my math's not great, but I believe that's 80% of all the text of Isaiah that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls attest to this one feature, that these appear to have been separate compositions in the 2nd and 1st century BCE, and were not combined together, at least not universally combined together.
My question is, in the face of all of this, what is the scholarly reaction? Maybe you don't know because some of this is quite recent, but like, are scholars looking at this
Brownlee
and going,
was
like,
writing about this in the 50s, so
sure, but I mean the
some of
recent
it,
stuff,
you're
like
right,
with
but
the machine learning and all this kind of
yes.
stuff. But like, yeah, we're looking at this and seeing all these data points. Are scholars looking at this and going like, okay, yeah, that's pretty conclusive, or is there dispute? Are people, because I can tell your level of confidence, and I'm trying to figure out if that is unique to you and scholars like you, or if that is just the conclusion that scholars are naturally led to.
This is as near as I can tell in the literature that has been published over the course of the last 10 or 15 years in critical journals and volumes. This is the accepted fact that and most of this stuff is just stuff written about 1Q Isaiah A. Far and away, scholars tend to posit and conclude that this is the way Isaiah was still being circulated in the 1st century BCE, very often in 2 separate compositions. Not always, but very often in 2 separate compositions. It's a developmental process, right? So it doesn't all happen all at once. It's something that's still taking place. But there appears to be a sense among the people who are writing and collecting these manuscripts that there's something definitely distinct about these two, essentially these two biblical books.
Now, am I right in thinking that there is some history of forgery in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, absolutely. It's more recent, but I'd be remiss to not point out that with the first discoveries, this question was already being raised. So, one of the first of the editors of the Dead Sea Scrolls published his journal entries in one of the volumes from 1953 when he was working on the digs at Mutabat. This is another site where manuscripts have been discovered, in which he tells of some of the Bedouin trying to sell him what he already recognized to be obvious forgeries. He noted that they had there were bits of leather, and they had Hebrew letters on them, but most of them were kind of nonsensical. Couldn't make heads or tails of what was on them. So this was already happening back in the 1950s. And then another scholar by the name of Solomon Zeitlin was the editor of the Jewish Quarterly Review, which is an academic journal, but he kind of ran it like his own little fiefdom, and went on a 15 or 20-year campaign starting in the 1940s and carried through all the way until his passing, attempting to argue that all the Dead Sea Scrolls were forgeries. We have this is in fact not the case, and we're confident about this in large part because even though most of the manuscript were discovered by non-specialists, by non-professionals, not in controlled archaeological digs, importantly, there were proper archaeological excavations in all 11 of the Qumran Caves and at the other sites where manuscripts were discovered. And one of the things that people don't notice or don't know is that the archaeologists who dug and in the caves found fragments, small fragments of manuscripts still there. And we've been able to match those to manuscripts that the Bedouin had actually brought in and sold. And in addition to that, these have been carbon dated. They have been DNA tested, which identifies, the types of animals that were used in their construction. There is just a variety of ways in which we have managed to confirm at least the fact that these are authentic ancient Jewish manuscripts. Some of the inks themselves from the manuscripts have been tested and reveal the same sort of thing. So that's to start. Now, starting around 1996, a private collector by the name of Martin Skoyen started to raise questions. He started to make inquiries about the possibility of buying fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls for his own private collection. When he approached you remember I mentioned the original Antiquities dealer who handled most of this material, named Kando, was still alive. Sorry, this was back in 1993. Still alive back in 1993. Skoyen actually approached him about the possibility of buying any scrolls fragments, and Kando responded to him and said, "Those days are gone." He said, "It's over." And then the next year, he passed away. But in the intervening time, over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, Martin Skoyen was able to purchase fragments of what he was told were Dead Sea Scrolls directly from Kando's heirs in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and from other antiquities dealers. They started circulating fragments purported to be from Dead Sea Scrolls in the United States, and many of these were sold to evangelical Christian institutions like Azusa Pacific University. Purchased 5 fragments for their special collections. Southwestern Baptist Seminary in Texas. I'm pretty sure it's in Texas. Yes. Southwestern Baptist Seminary in Texas purchased 9 fragments, almost all from the Kando family, that they added to their special collections. And the Museum of the Bible, of course, in Washington, D.C., purchased 14 fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. There was a time, I think in around 2009, 2010, where we counted as many as 140 individual small fragments of manuscripts thought to be from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but were sold in private antiquities markets between 2002 and that time, so 2010, 2011, and which were not ever identified with the original site, with the original finds at Qumran or anywhere else in the Judean desert. I had the opportunity to work directly on fragments from both the Skoyen collection, the collection of manuscripts belonging to Martin Skoyen. He owns 32 small fragments, and the fragments belonging to the Museum of the Bible. And in the work that I did over the course of a few years, looking very closely at both of these separate private collections, I and some of my colleagues started to develop strong suspicions that these were, in fact, modern forgeries and that they were not part of the original scrolls discoveries at all. I think the remarkable thing in all this is that so many people within the field, so many people who should probably know better, I myself, for a long period of time, were duped by this. We're able to be convinced that these might, in fact, actually be authentic, genuine artifacts from
I mean, yeah, these are
the Dead Sea
on
Scrolls.
display from 2017 when the
Yeah.
Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
opens, these fragments are on display as legitimate Dead Sea Scroll fragments.
Absolutely. Yes. So, and I was part of that. I was part of that entire project. In fact,
And how do we know that they're? Oh,
so this is you can't get this anymore, by the way,
uh-huh.
because it's been retracted on the fact that it's full of forgeries. But this is the official publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Museum of the Bible collection that I co-edited
Whoa!
with Emmanuel Tove and Robert Duke. So
And
like
it's got those 16 fake
14
fragments
of
in
the
it.
16 are
14
in
of the
there.
16. So
Yes.
you've got
Yes.
the publication of the Washington
Yeah.
D.C. fragments of
Yeah.
the Dead Sea Scrolls book, and
And at the
what a piece
time,
of history. That's crazy.
right. And yeah, I've also got this one too. This is the collection of the Scoian fragments. I think you can see my name down there
Yes.
as well. But
Yeah, limited
so
signed copies are available for
this
$5,000.
this one still is available because it's
Yeah.
not all for. There are some actual authentic Dead Sea Scrolls fragments in here. A few of the fragments, I'll just say this. Some of the first ones to be sold in the 90s to Martin Scoian were fragments that he bought from the descendants of scholars who had worked on the originals.
Mhm.
So John Trevor and William Brownlee, some of these scholars who were part of the original team in the 1940s and the 1950s had like tiny little pieces of things like the community rule or the Genesis Apocryphon that had fallen off, and they just managed to keep, like they and so they held on to for mementos. Those are the sorts of things we're confident, like, that's not a fake. That's real. They were there when, this little piece flaked off, and they were able to keep it for themselves. So, but those are the sorts of the first fragments that Martin Scoian purchased were these types of
And
fragments. But
how
then,
much do these fragments cost? Like, say the Museum of the Bible purchases 16 fragments. I mean, I'm sure we don't know the exact numbers, but what kind of amount of money are we talking about here to buy these?
uh, and like individual fragments, you're talking about six figures for an individual fragment, and these are tiny,
Oh
right?
boy.
Like, I mean, I'll just pull up one of these for you to give you an idea. Let's go to you can probably, so here, this fragment of Exodus chapter 17 measures 3.27 by 3.05 centimeters,
Wow.
right? Like, they are
And you
tiny.
hundreds of thousands of dollars
Yes.
for just one of these
Yes.
tiny
In
little
fact,
fragments.
so now some of them are a little bit bigger, right? Like,
Mm.
some of the ones that were purchased by the Southwestern Baptist Seminary were a little bit bigger than that. So like
Man, that
probably
is a lot of
like
money. Can you tell
it
us some more
is.
about how to make forged documents and how to get away with it? I'm really interested in this
I'm
whole
sure you
forgery
are.
business.
Everyone
Yeah.
is. I
That is incredible.
but the some of the people who made these texts were paying close attention to various features that would help them pass as authentic, right? Like, for example, there's one fragment from Scoian's collection. It's a papyrus fragment from the Book of Enoch. And after we started observing and seeing a number of scribal and textual anomalies that had convinced I and the team I was working with that these were probably forgeries. After this happened, we managed to get a number of them forensically tested by physicists in Berlin. And one of the discoveries that was made in one of these tests was of this papyrus fragment of First Enoch. They noticed under like extremely high microscope, like under what do you call that? I guess under just high magnification. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things discovered under extreme high magnification was the presence of salt crystals on the fragment, which is something that you do see on authentic fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, ones that haven't been cleaned and prepared for conservation and presentation, right? And I mean, this makes some sense. The area is a very highly it's a highly saline environment, right? Lots of
Mm-hmm.
salt, but uh, the appearance of naturally occurring salt crystals under magnification looks quite distinct. Some of these look like the best way I can describe them are as like basalt structures or like cool crystals that wooey people like to collect. You know,
Yeah.
now what the physicists discovered on this one fragment of Enoch was salt crystals, but these were all cubical. And then when they tested them, they discovered that they were table salt. Now, you probably don't even have to know this to understand what I'm getting at, but table salt wasn't invented until the 14th or the 15th century. It's like a modern thing. There's a whole chemical process that takes place in order to turn naturally occurring salt into table salt. And here there were not just table salt crystals scattered across the surface of this papyrus fragment, but there was ink on top of some of these uh, pieces of table salt on the fragment. So clearly, and this is the only the sort of thing that you can detect when you're working that up close to something
Right.
too, right? So, but like that was one of the things that we would see. Another feature that we noticed was that in particular with parchment, this happens with papyrus too, but in particular with parchment, as it ages and as it dries out, the surface layer starts to deteriorate or to flake away. And we see examples of this in the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. You will notice if you're looking through a number of the fragments in the collection that there will be parts where the surface itself is just completely flaked off. And it's taken all the text with it. So you'll encounter bits like this on fragments. What we started to see among what I'm going to call the modern post 2002 Dead Sea Scrolls forgeries, what we started to see on a number of these were, in the first place, they're very, very poorly prepared or preserved. The surfaces are incredibly coarse, rough. Compared to the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't particularly look like prepared parchments. In actual fact, they look more just like ancient prepared, like ancient leather, maybe that you would use for other things like wineskins or shoes. So you can already tell just by looking at them that whoever's writing on these is already struggling with his surface or her surface, just to be able to write smoothly on something that's so rough. But then something else that we started to notice is that there were delaminated portions on some of these fragments, but there's writing on that too, which is, not something that would happen if this is a fragment that had been sitting out in the desert and had deteriorated over thousands of years. All that writing would have disappeared with the surface when it deteriorated, just like what we see in the authentic Dead Sea Scrolls. Now I don't even
So
remember what your question was. Sorry.
about forgery and how we know that
Um,
that these are forged. And so presumably, like, who's like the ones that you were looking at? Like, who was it that owned those particular fragments?
So those were the ones that I was looking at were in Martin Scoyne's private collection in Norway, and those
Yeah.
belonging to the Museum of the Bible.
Okay, but presumably
I
you then approach these guys and
so
you sort of say, look, you might have a
yeah,
problem here.
I'll tell you the story here. So the team that I was working with in Norway. We approached Mr. Scoyen and we spoke to him about some of the problems with his fragments, and he's the one who gave us the permission to run all these additional tests, and we ended up publishing an article in a scholarly journal outlining the features of that we had detected indicating forgery on 9 of the fragments in Scoyen's collection. I personally think that number's higher, but these were the ones we were able to test, and these were the ones that we were able to agree on as being almost certainly forgeries. So we're working on the stuff in Scoyen's collection when I started working for the Museum of the Bible and working on their collection of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments. At the time, it was policy for everyone to sign a non-disclosure agreement whenever they gained employment working for the Museum of the Bible. And as a result of that, I was kind of sequestered and alone in my my thoughts and my discussions about these fragments that they had at the Museum of the Bible. I spoke to other people who were working on them with me, but we were not allowed to talk to anybody outside of this circle. And this went on for 2 years until the time of the publication of the volume. And by this time, because I've already been looking at the stuff at the Scoyen collection and seeing the same sorts of things, I started also developing a keener eye of what to look for and how to detect forgery. And so I started to develop some very strong feelings about the problems in the Museum of the Bible fragments as well. Leading up to the publication of the volume, I was asked to write a chapter on the physical on the physical characteristics of the fragments and the paleography. So it was in that chapter I actually wrote a couple of paragraphs detailing some of my thoughts and my observations with regards to a number of the fragments, which suggested that they were probably modern forgeries. I turned it in to the other editors, and I was happy that they just published everything as it was. And all of this kind of happened right around the same time. This has happened around the same time that we also published the article about the Scoyen fragments. And of course, some of this got picked up by the Newswire. It's pretty salacious stuff, forgeries in the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Museum of the Bible, right around the time that the museum was opening as well. So it kind of became something that consumed my attention for the next several years. I continued working with the museum and helping them sort out what to do with their now complete collection of forged Dead Sea Scrolls.
Man, so were they grateful to you? Were they annoyed? Like, what was the sort of feeling? And
Yeah.
especially the guy who was like the private collector, like he must have
Yeah,
been pretty
so
gutted.
he was. And of course, because he doesn't have, you know, as much money as God does, the Green family is apparently, above such concerns. But yeah, he was definitely his response. And I was appreciative of the fact that he was as forthcoming and transparent as he was in the first place when it came to pursuing this question even.
Mm.
What do you do if you have forgeries in your collection? What do you do as a private collector when you discover that you have forgeries in your collection? Suddenly, your collection is not worth nearly as much as it
Mm.
was the day before, right? He had spent like real money on this material, and we were in the process of dramatically devaluing it. So
Mm.
there were many lengthy, painful correspondences between us and the
Like, can you somehow, like, can you find out who forged this, where it came from? Because there must be some kind of way, at least he must know who he bought it from at the very least, you know? Is there any way
yeah.
to figure out what happened there and who's to
Well,
blame, and maybe some
this
legal implications?
remains the open question. And it's something that this was one of the before I ran out of funding, this is what I was in the process of working on. That's one of the things I did when I was working with the Museum of the Bible, was tracking down, going through their documentation and trying to track down chains of custody, chains of ownership, just to sort of see if I could discover a source. There's another project that was underway. I think they've wrapped up now, but they were underway for 5 years in Norway, investigating not this question directly, but certainly putting together materials for gaining a more comprehensive understanding of the history of ownership of these fragments. So there's been work underway. As you can imagine, there's a lot of very sensitive uh legal stipulations and situations involved here, where as much as I think I might have an idea of where these things came from, um I'm just not in a position to be able to broadcast that, in large part because I don't have the evidence for it. All I have are suspicions, and until we have some concrete, clear-cut evidence which shows us where they came from, there's not much anybody can do.
Right.
So it's
So
a
so
it's a
they're just out of
sensitive
luck, basically.
it's a sensitive situation, yeah, and
Yeah.
they are just out of luck. So, and this is, I mean, the museum responded by the Museum of the Bible basically responded by shuttering that part of the exhibition. For a while, they had a placard on display that I helped them write about the great uncertainty of the
Mm.
authenticity of the manuscripts in the exhibit, but eventually
Uh,
the exhibit itself just ended up getting.
I suppose that is part of the risk of collecting manuscripts, is that, you know, people put a lot of money into just trying to validate these texts before they buy them. It's a whole convoluted process because, of course, like, I know more about this from like Gnostic gospels, but the idea,
Yeah.
like with the Gospel of Judas, I mentioned earlier, how, you know, Bart
Right.
Ehrman, along with a group of others, were sent by National Geographic to verify, and the owner was like, I want to give you enough that you can verify it, but I don't want to give you too much because you haven't bought it yet. And so a lot of effort has to go into very carefully making sure that you've done just enough to know that this is real. And part of the risk of that is that you might just get scammed. It's a very sort of dubious industry in that respect.
Yeah, and it's not the only reason, but it's certainly a reason why most scholars, many scholars, certainly, I'd like to think most scholars are very concerned and very vocal about the sorts of problems with the private antiquities market, with private collecting of antiquities, just because I mean, in the first place, it's problematic to own cultural heritage that belongs to another people,
Mm.
another group. To set monetary value on that is really problematic. But this is the sort of thing that also promotes looting and trafficking and all sorts of human abuses that we don't want to participate in. Much of the antiquities market, the private antiquities market, has been deeply infected by uh, artifacts stolen out of museums, like the National Museum of Baghdad, and the funds collected through the sales of these artifacts have gone to fund ISIS and the Taliban, and all of these
Whoa.
groups of people that none of us want to be supporting. So it becomes an incredibly problematic situation when you're dealing with private antiquities markets, and it creates great problems for the scholars who are actually trying to do legitimate work on legitimate manuscripts, because as soon as you start introducing a fragment of a manuscript and that you don't know anything about, you don't know where it came from, you can date it using the conventional methods that you have on hand, but without the kind of um, chain of ownership that comes with a properly provenanced artifact from an actual archaeological dig. It creates issues with how we incorporate that sort of information into our broader data set of the period. It can be really frustrating for scholars and for scholarship, just trying to even sort out what to do with some of this stuff. So, but I'll get off my soapbox now. It's just these are real issues that affect real people, and certainly the scholarship as well.
Mm.
Um,
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a sort of endlessly fascinating topic in that it's not just about the content of the text, but the
yeah,
manuscripts that they're written on, and the ink, and the materials, and the
yeah.
dating, and the communities, and the sale, and the history, like it's everything from the iconic, famous story of their discovery by accident. Somebody's searching for a sheep and chucking a stone into a cave and hearing a sound. The whole story is I think plays into this feeling that people have that we're dealing with this strange and mysterious, like there's always something to discover. There's something almost mythical about the story that's told
I'll
about
I'll
these
I'll tell
scrolls. It's
I'll
wonderful.
tell you another story that feeds into this, right? So yeah, so you'll remember this professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University managed to purchase 3 of the manuscripts. Um, and he traveled, like, at the time, he had to go from Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, where he lived and where the university was, through, uh he had to get a pass and go through military checkpoints, at this time of political turmoil, just to get to Bethlehem to purchase these manuscripts and then get them home. It was, a risky, dangerous ordeal for him just to do this. But he tells the story in his journals, which have been published, about his adventures in doing so. He comes back to his house on Mount Scopus and runs up to his study and starts poring over these manuscripts. And this all takes place on November 29th, 1947. It's late in the evening. He's looking over a manuscript of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Horayot, this famous collection of songs and hymns. And he is keenly aware that he's the first Westerner, the first scholar to look at this stuff in over 2,000 years. And meanwhile, in the background on the radio, his son is listening to the resolution pass on the floor of the United Nations to establish and ratify the state of Israel. And he says in his journal something to the effect of how this momentous occasion was celebrated in my study on the one event political, the other event spiritual. It's a moving moment, but it kind of helps to establish just how important this connection was, certainly in the early going, between Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, but this story doesn't end there. Um, in the intervening years, many more scrolls are discovered. They eventually all get nationalized by the state of Israel. They all end up back in Israel, and they are, collected and preserved by the Israel Antiquities Authority, except for a number that still belong to the state of Jordan at this time, which is not it's still outside. It's in what is properly called the West Bank. And this is how the situation was for a couple of decades. When in 1967, some 20 years later, the 6-Day War erupts in June, and Israel manages to conquer and annex all this additional territory in the West Bank, including a number of the holdings that were part of the Jordanian collection. But beyond that, after the dust settles, one of the first things that happens is that Kando, the antiquities dealer, who handled almost all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, gets a visit from agents of the Israeli government, and they enter his house and they question him, and then they come back and they confiscate from him the Temple Scroll, which is the largest of the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts. It was held back by Kando for a rainy day. He had his sights on, selling this someday and cashing in and having a fabulous retirement as a result of this. He held on to it for all this time. The way the story tends to be told is that the man who put these events into motion was an archaeologist and a statesman and a soldier by the name of Yigal Yadin. Now, this wasn't his given name. This was his adopted name. This is something that Jewish revolutionary fighters did during their pursuit of independence in the 1940s. Yigal Yadin actually happens to be the son of Eliezer Sukenik. He was one of the first people who knew of the existence of the Dead Sea Scrolls from his father. And he happened to be the deputy prime minister in 1967 during the 6-Day War, on the conclusion of which he had in mind that Kando had this manuscript, at least this one manuscript, if not many others, in his home in Bethlehem, which was now part of Israeli territory. So, some of these things are connected in surprising ways. And one of the things that I think we should pay close attention to is how much the narrative of the Dead Sea Scrolls, not just their ancient narrative, but their modern narrative, tends to be connected to political events, to cultural events, to religious events. I mean, it's no accident that the forgeries of the Dead Sea Scrolls that ended up on the private antiquities market were by and large purchased by very enthusiastic, conservative, evangelical Christian institutions. So, and just on that note, on that point, just to kind of reinforce what this looks like, when Azusa Pacific University purchased their 9 fragments, one of these was and these are all forgeries. One of these was a fragment containing text on 4 lines from Leviticus chapter 18 and Leviticus chapter 20. These are notorious texts for their condemnation of homosexuality. And when these fragments, when the collection was purchased, there was an interview in one of the papers with the director of the exhibit, a man by the name of Bruce McCoy. And the quotation that he gave to the newspapers was that Southwestern Seminary actually paid quite a bit of extra money for this particular fragment because, in his words, it attests to a timeless truth known from Scripture. Now, on the face of it, this is kind of silly. From an historical perspective, this is kind of silly because nobody was collecting proof texts in Roman Palestine about homosexuality. Because of course they weren't. It was a different kind of world back then. They weren't engaged in the same sorts of culture wars that we are today. But an insightful forger might have had in mind exactly what his buyers were willing to pay for. And this is what he came up with.
Man, yeah, that's quite the tale, isn't it? And yeah, I don't think it will escape people that I mean, you mentioned interdisciplinary research earlier about the actual texts themselves, but there's also an intersection of theology and history and textual criticism, which, depending on which of those angles you're coming from, there will be a different significance to the Dead Sea Scrolls. If your interest is theological, it will be, in some instances, quite reconfirming, like in the instance of the Isaiah scroll. You're going to think, wow, that's great. The story's basically the same. From a textual critical perspective, you're going to think, isn't it interesting how it's changed, or what variants there are, or what we might be able to gauge about the different authorship of Isaiah? If you're looking from a historical perspective, it's like, well, what can we learn about the people who wrote these and the things that they valued? You've spoken about how elsewhere the prevalence of certain texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls gives us an idea of their popularity at the time of the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least the storage. So we can learn historically about the people who were reading these texts as well. And we know the influence it had because the texts which show up the most in the Dead Sea Scrolls are the ones that are most referenced in the New Testament.
Isn't that interesting, right?
And the New Testament is written sort of around the same time or just after the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so we've got this. It might not be okay, so maybe the Dead Sea Scrolls is an anomaly. Maybe they just happen to really like this Isaiah book and they don't really care about some other ones. But the fact that it comes together in that the ones that appear a bunch in the Dead Sea Scrolls are referenced a bunch in the New Testament, and the ones which aren't in the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't really referenced in the New Testament. We're learning a lot about the historical,
and we're not just talking about what. Yeah, and we're not just talking about what most Protestants certainly recognize as Scripture, because in addition to the texts from the Bible or from the Protestant Bible that the writers of the New Testament really liked, like Isaiah, like Genesis, like the Psalms, like Deuteronomy, they also in the New Testament quoted in the book of Jude, First Enoch, which was a text that was enormously popular for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have multiple copies of First Enoch. Some of our earliest manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls are of First Enoch. We have a plethora of additional literature, which is clearly based on First Enoch in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just, it's just expanded as much as it's expanded our perspective and understanding of this world of ancient Judaism. It's also just brought to light how much the writers of the New Testament and the first Christians and those in the early church were a huge part of this Jewish world, and maybe in ways that are uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah. Well, if people want to dive even deeper on this, I mean, we've been speaking for the better part of 2.5 hours now, but there are more and more hours if you wish to find them on your YouTube channel, Kipp, which of course is linked in the description. You've got a whole series on the Dead Sea Scrolls and its history and its discovery, but all kinds of streams and videos and series and interviews and all kinds of stuff to be found on your channel. So if people are interested, they know where to go. Kipp Davis, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a long time coming that I would do a video on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we managed to get through the whole of it without mentioning any recent scandals involving this ancient text. So I think we've done a pretty good job.
How about that?
Yeah,
awesome.
What do you know?
Thanks.
So thanks again. Thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's been my pleasure.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you might like my previous episode with Bart Ehrman on the Gnostic Gospel of Judas. You can watch it by clicking the link on your screen. To support the channel and get early, ad-free access to videos, subscribe to my Substack at alexoconnor.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.